Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give everyone a second to join in the conversation and finish part 3, this week's final one, as we've been leading through pieces of music and programming and looking at see if we can combine all these different issues into changing the future of our audiences, perhaps even the way we present music, looking at if there are even possibilities to change the future of music and its audiences. There's a common belief that we don't have enough young people or younger people or people from different backgrounds. The audiences aren't diverse enough. The audiences aren't young enough. And perhaps we need to look at a way that we can, as performers and music lovers, can actually change that. And I do think a big part of it is going to be programming. Before we continue, I'm going to say hello to everybody that's on there. I see Luwazi has joined us, which is wonderful to have him here. Luwazi, for the choir members, was one of our conducting students at a workshop we did a few years ago, teaching music, and currently Grahamstown, but moving to Pretoria. So hopefully as a younger sort of music lover, he will be able to help later with the conversation. And Beverly, good morning. So I'll say good morning to everybody once. And what I'd like to do today is I want to talk for a bit. And then at the end, I'm going to ask for any sort of questions or comments. That way we can sort of get through the topic. And then we can have a bit of a sort of discussion, hopefully about ideas going forward. Is it even possible? Right, I'm going to say good morning now to everybody there that is up, and then I'm going to say we're going to go on. Okay. I think the biggest thing that faces us, certainly in a place like South Africa, is how do you reach across different boundaries? And I must say, I'm not just talking about different sort of socioeconomic groups or heritage backgrounds. I'm talking about age. I'm talking about all sorts of different probable problems that we face to reach audiences. I think the big thing we talked about programming last week is how do we combine the music? And I think before we go on, I want us to talk a little bit about the differences that we face in the modern era than we may have faced when many of us were listening and starting our love of music. Most of us came from families where people played music or we were exposed to concerts. There was a greater sort of access to live concerts, perhaps. And our parents took us there or played recordings. We talked about that from the very first conversation we had 3 weeks ago. Why do you reach out to a certain piece? And maybe that is a part of how we can look forward, is the exposure. The other thing we need to remember, the world is a lot faster in many, many ways. And especially families, the enormous amount of time that is taken up just with work and schooling and extramurals is quite excessive. So do people even have the time? And maybe that's something we need to look at as well as we look forward to programming. The other thing is, if you're going to go out, do people really want to sit still for 2 to 3 hours anymore in silence? Many of us agree and many of us understand. And I think this is why this particular talk is so relevant. We have all gotten now through these lockdowns to a point where we remember what silence, I think, is about. We remember what slowing down is perhaps a little bit more about. We're not running around frantically. There are many, many problems. This is not an ideal situation, but it has certainly slowed down. And I think a lot of people have looked at what it is they want from life, perhaps in the future, and maybe chosen to work even faster or move or maybe slow down a bit. And I think certainly for music, and all kinds of music, this is our moment to look at our place in the future. There's going to be a desperate need as we slowly come out of this great pandemic to heal, to be together, to create connections again. And I think music is going to play a massive part with that. Can we go back to what it was? I must say I don't think we can in many ways. And I think the biggest thing we need to look at is how are we going to program for the people that might look for something different in their lives, look for a different type of entertainment, different type of concert. Remember that the world is also in some ways sped up in that television, movies, streaming, social media take up an enormous amount of time. Online gaming for many, many people. As I said last week, an enormous number of people online playing video games. So leaving the house has become, without the lockdown, has become less and less sort of important in some ways. Going out for entertainment is not necessarily the same as it used to be. Now you can sit in your home and with a decent Wi-Fi system and connection and speakers, you can stream Berlin Philharmonic into your house. This has been a saving grace, I think, in this lockdown period where we can reach out across the world and has shown us what is actually possible. What are the things that you are looking at? What are the things that interest you as you go online, looking for entertainment, looking for healing, looking for a message, whatever it is you're looking for? What are you going online and searching when it comes to your musical choices? As we talked about, many of us go online and go out and search for music that we feel comfortable with, that we know, that we understand. And I think that is something we must never forget. The problem is balancing that understanding of what we love and what we know with moving forward. Because what many of us would understand as a piece that we are excited about or a type of concert, many others don't feel the same way. And especially the younger generation where we haven't really seen them exposed to music in the same way. A lot of education has changed in the schools, the exposure of symphonic music or choral symphonic music or opera through fewer radio stations. There's a far less access to many, many different types of music, so that very few people actually get a chance to experience something slightly different. That being said, with this enormous connectivity that we are seeing in the world, isn't that the perfect platform for the exposure of different types of music and different experiences to many, many different people? Obviously, there is the big question. In the 20th century, more and more concerts and performances became or seemed to become more and more elitist. Tickets became more and more expensive because it is an expensive art form. Funding from governments became less potentially. And the audiences became wealthier. They became more in charge of the sort of ownership of the performance. And I think a lot of ensembles and performing groups focused entirely on that audience. When you have a hall of 1,500 people to fill, you want to fill that 1,500 in some way. Now, the question is that short-sighted, or is that really what we should be looking at? Is that what we are? We've created an art form for a certain age group of people, a certain demographic, a certain wealth or social standing. That is actually, oddly enough, a fairly modern concept in many ways. Yes, a lot of, as we know with Haydn, a lot of them worked for employers that were royal and the nobility, and they were nothing more than servants or high-powered, high-paid servants in those courts, and they performed and wrote for those employers and their friends. But from Mozart on, we see quite a different sort of experience where they become sort of in their own right, popular musicians or rock musicians of the time, with mammoth symphony concerts that would go on for hours and hours. I can tell you one thing, hour and hour-long concerts will not work anymore. So how do you reach across this sort of barrier of supposed elitism? And the question maybe is it something we should actually embrace? Rather, it is elitist. It is something for a certain kind of palate, a certain kind of person, and stop trying to reach over into places or groups of people that necessarily we are wasting our time. Somebody once pointed out to me, you know, this conversation has been had for over 100 years. not enough younger people in the audiences, and yet the symphonies still keep going on. We still have audiences. We still have the same people as they get older, potentially look to something different and find their entertainment or their solace or their comfort or their enjoyment in the sort of classical world. I must say, I'm not, yes, I agree. I think that's a portion of it. But I think our concern is going to be, are those people, is this generation doing enough to make sure that there are people exposed at an earlier age and that are being led towards going to concerts, going out? And I think this is the bigger problem, is why would anybody want to go out? What is there that is so much more beneficial to go to a symphony concert or go to an opera than staying at home and just sort of watching it online? I think there's been an enormous change in live music on all fields. The rock concerts of the 80s, 25,000 plus people, 50,000 people at concerts, Wembley Stadium. We don't really see that to the same extent anymore either. In fact, in the early 2000s, the Symphony Orchestra League in the United States, American Symphony Orchestra League, joined with VH1 in an attempt to promote live music as a whole. The troubadours singing in restaurants and sort of in bars, is that still the same? Are those experiences still available out there? Yes, I know we have many people in bars and coffee shops with their original music. Is it done in such a way that it will actually bring more people to come and watch live music or not? So I think the problem is twofold. One, what are we doing as lovers of music to encourage and expose people to the music that we love and we enjoy? And the other one is, what are we doing to encourage people to leave the house, to actually come out and experience a live concert? Obviously, that statement is more relevant when we're not in lockdown, because right now nobody can leave the house. But I think this is in a moment, through these talks, I feel I can somehow reach people with different ideas. This is a moment for us to really look at this. What can we do? And certainly, as this is from the Symphony Choir page, what can we as the Symphony Choir do to encourage our people to bring people from different backgrounds, different age groups, people who love music of different genres, to come and experience something? We're not going to change the world of every single human being, but I think one or two people is where we start. I know this is a very sort of Americanist type concept. Well, I'm certainly blamed for this. My first thing is, we have to look at what are we actually selling. I know, very marketing, business-like, but it's true. We are still selling a product. And if we don't want to sell it, why are we not funding it and then sort of making it free for everybody? There's always the question of the high price of tickets. The reality is everything costs quite a lot. Going to a rugby match can be quite expensive. Going to a soccer game, cricket, these are not always cheap. They're certainly not always affordable. And yet rugby, soccer in particular, are packed to the brim more times than empty. What is it that they are doing right? It maybe seems like a bit of a bizarre comparison, but I do think there is some comparison, especially as we're all being concerts, sporting events, all being put in the same category for, once the lockdown is over. There's also been an interesting shift, and I read an article quite some time ago, and it sort of stayed quite relevant to me even as we move now into this era. A lot of what was considered classical symphonic music has been relegated to the world of light classics. The Carmen suites by Bizet, the Alsacienne suites by Bizet, Finlandia, some Saint-Saëns, a number of Saint-Saëns works, Holberg suites. They've been relegated as light classics and only classics for outdoor concerts or the general population. The symphony concerts, the remaining in Cape Town, the Thursday night, in Joburg, I think it's a Wednesday and a Thursday night concerts, are devoted to deep, seriously intense music, symphonies of Mahler, Beethoven, Bruckner. I've never quite understood why. I think that takes an emphasis on away from what we are actually about, which is sound. The sound of a symphony orchestra or a choir and an orchestra together. What makes Finlandia any less relevant, say, than a Tchaikovsky overture? Not 1812, because that seems to be relegated to light classics as well. The next thing is people then say, oh, but it's just so much better. What makes one work better than another? So my question and my biggest thing about this talk is to challenge you, as music lovers, people who love the symphony choir sounds, people who love the music that is written for symphony choirs, people that love music of symphony orchestras, that love operas. Find a way to expose those around you to different musics. And the challenge, I think, for managements and programmers in certainly in South Africa, because a lot more is being done in Europe with more adventurous programming, is to challenge our audiences to some extent. And unfortunately, we run the risk of losing audiences. And that is the greatest fear when you are facing potential funding problems. I think the biggest way is to look at how many different types of audience. There's an argument for saying, if you do a pop concert with a popular band with a symphony backing, that will bring people to the symphony orchestra. I personally have never quite agreed with that. There was an interesting article a few years ago about American orchestras where they do more and more light classics, as we just talked about, concerts, and more sort of pop concerts, Beatles revivals with bands that go around the country and perform Beatles tunes and whatever. And interestingly enough, the orchestras that have stuck to their core business, I would say, which is their symphony concerts, mixing up symphony concerts, mixing them up with their programming, have actually, in the last few years, been more successful in bringing more people to their symphony concerts than those that have used the light classics. And I think this is a lesson we must learn. We cannot continue, in my opinion, to program as if everybody is going to come ultimately to a symphony concert. People have different likes. People have less time. I think the concept of programming is to look at the bigger picture, the whole picture, and say, what can we do for this person? The concept of focused marketing, focused programming with a basic outcome is my personal belief in the future. The other thing is to stop assuming that young people have no interest in an orchestra or in symphonic music. I think that is an enormous fallacy. I think they actually have far greater exposure, and I know there was heresy last weekend when I said this, but through things like video games, movie soundtracks. Many of the high-end movie soundtracks are exceptionally well-crafted pieces of music. When do those movie soundtracks get considered to be serious symphonic music? The Magic Flute of Mozart was written as the Singspiel for a comedy house, a bawdy event where the audience yelled and screamed and there was great entertainment on the stage, and yet it is now seen as high art. Baroque opera, if you read a bit about Baroque opera, there was certainly no real control of the composer. The performances were done in these rather loud, bawdy concert halls with people yelling and picnicking and drinking, and the soloists would have a group of people that they would pay to come and cheer and scream, and then they would stop and improvise entire cadenzas at the drop of a hat just to show off their ability. That is now seen, sort of Baroque opera, Magic Flute and such, as high art in many, many ways. Are those particular works not similar to, say, the Star Wars themes of John Williams? Are they not the future of that in the next 100 years? Maybe it's time to look at that slightly differently. Maybe it's time to understand that there is a connection between that music and the music we perform as a symphony choir or as a symphony orchestra. And it comes back to the other thing is our programming has to have connections throughout the program. I talked about that a lot last week, and it's something I believe in. Firstly, looking at our audiences, saying in a series of our concerts. And so it's programming on two levels. One, on the bigger scheme, the overarching scheme, the overarching picture of all our concerts together. And then underneath that, looking at each individual concert and who are we aiming this at? I don't think you can do things for everybody anymore. The options are just too great. The opportunities for entertainment on so many levels, certainly in a city like Cape Town, is so vast that we cannot, I believe, do something for everyone. That being said, you have to, only this person is allowed here and that person is allowed there. It brings me to another thing that is a pet peeve, and maybe we should talk about that, the concept of concert etiquette. Time and time again, when talking to young people or inexperienced concert goers, they say that what turns them away is often the fact that they get looked down at if they clap in the wrong place, or they make a noise in the wrong place, or cough or whatever, or cheer too loudly. And this has been something that has bothered me for quite some time, because on the other side, I have my more seasoned concert goers that will come and say, "Oh, I don't, why can't they learn the right etiquette?" How do people learn etiquette when they have no exposure? And is some of that etiquette maybe something that was developed because of a societal norm, or is it something that is truly part of the experience? Is there really a reason why you cannot clap between movements? Many times in symphonies, there is no real connection between each and every movement. I've often find it quite exciting to go to a concert or perform a concert, and at the end of something truly powerful, the audience is moved to applaud, moved to be a part of that experience. There are times when that is problematic, I understand that, but are we looking rather for a purity of performance over a long-term audiences, or are we looking to bring people into this wonderful art form and these fantastic musical works and these masterpieces, regardless? The other thing is cell phones. I understand that is a big problem, and I must say I'm not entirely sure where I land on that myself. Should cell phones be allowed? I know a number of orchestras have tried the whole thing of, tweet where you are, put it out there on social media that you're at the concert. Please feel free to tweet. But those lights and flashing distracts other concert goers that have no interest. Is it not time to have separate parts for people to be on their phones? Just using of technology might often bring a different group of people in where they feel welcome and they can read their program on their phone and their back. I don't know. These are questions and things that I do believe, though, we should be asking ourselves. How can we maybe make something more user-friendly, to quote a very sort of common terminology for applications on the phone, on the computers, or is it not something that should become user-friendly? That becomes the difficult thing. I'm going to finish with one little thing that ties into last week. I believe that younger generations have a far greater affinity with modern music and modern composers than they would potentially have with something written 300 or 400 years ago. The sounds that are used in many modern compositions are so varied now, so different, from very, very simplistic to exceptionally complex, that they actually run the gamut of emotion. I believe in programming is about exactly that combination. Finding the connections, and I said this last week and I'm going to say it again, the way to bring people to concerts is to try and make connections with their lives, with their needs, with their experiences. I don't believe we can bring everybody to everything. Programs need to be put towards who we are aiming at, what groups of people, and they need to be I believe, as open as possible. Put something completely new together with something wonderful, something old and beloved. Create a significance for both those pieces. Champion the music of great young composers, not just by as a programmer putting it out there, but as an audience member going, trying to understand it, learning as much as you can, and going to that concert and supporting that person, because they are trying something that without an audience is almost impossible. Right, as I said at the beginning, what I want to do today is to try and make this a little bit more interactive. I have my ideas, I put a lot of ideas out there, but as this is the last part of last session of this 3-part conversation, I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say. I know there are many people that feel that the status quo is fantastic, and that's great. So I'm looking for your ideas as well, and it helps me because then I understand sort of what people want, how people see it, and we can have a discussion about maybe I need to change the way I look, or maybe the way we go about concerts can change, or ideas that we can bring forward and actually make it a collective. I think the world is moving and should move towards a greater collective, where the interaction with the audiences as a whole, not just one or two individual people or patrons or donors, the audience as a whole becomes your number one goal. All right, Helga. Yes, the applauding. It is accepted, and I must say I watched an opera once where the Italian audience went so mad at the end. The guy stopped and sang the entire piece again, the whole aria over again. Now, if anything, an opera has a storyline, and it has to continue. Did it disrupt the story? Sure. Did it disrupt the enjoyment of the audience? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So sometimes, yes, there is a connection between the two movements, and you as the performer, I think that is your responsibility. I remember once doing an opera aria, we ended at the first part ends loud and huge. It was from Otello, and it then moves into something quiet, and the audience went crazy right afterwards, and with one flick of a hand, you're able to silence them without the sort of uncomfortable, oh, you shouldn't be clapping, whatever. Do we embrace it, or do we put out words that might and feelings that might alienate less experienced concert goers? That's my feeling as well, Lenora. Applause is a response very much to an emotionally rousing performance. When I did Enigma Variations once, we had quite a large group of younger audience goers, and at certain movements, especially the one of the dog, it's such fun, it's so crazy that they started applauding, and these were very unseasoned concert goers. They'd come because of our soloist, and they absolutely loved that experience. And that is what I want people to do. Sometimes feel happy and excited. Sorry to hear that, Mary. Bev, maybe one concert here less classical in addition to the festive concerts. Yes, I agree. Now, my question is, will that change our audiences for our Mozarts and our Haydns and our Beethovens? Sorry, everybody, if you're having problems. You can go back and watch it, and I'm very happy to take conversations later where if you comment on this particular post, I will happily answer them via my own sort of communication by typing and answering your questions. Beverly, you have a chance to respond to that. The Hammerstein brings a different audience, potentially. Will it change the audiences in other concerts? I'm not so sure. But I agree with you. Having concerts designated for different groups, different lovers of certain types of music is very, very important. I know everybody has great opinions, and I really am looking for that because I'm putting out my opinions, and I'd be fascinated to hear what you guys have to think. I'm sorry about the connection. I have no idea what's going on in that one. I think that is often the case, yes. Maybe it would whet their appetites for something and we can hope. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the concerts you're suggesting, but it also doesn't mean we should do them to increase our symphony choir concerts of Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, and stuff like that. We should do them specifically for those people. And now the crossover could easily happen. Yeah, I feel that as well, Jan. I must have been toying with the idea of having a potentially cell phone free zone and a cell phone zone in concerts where people can read the program on their phones that they've downloaded. They have had links to other backgrounds. We have amazing technology. So if you decide you're going to a concert, you download your program, and on the program are connections to other performances on YouTube or other conversations. So if you want to learn more about a piece before you go to the concert, and certainly if you're promoting modern music, that would be a wonderful possibility. And then have a section where there are people that want no lights, in your audience area, that have no lights that will bother them and stuff like that. I know it's tricky, and it's purely an idea I've been toying with, but somehow we have to bring modern technology into this experience so that it isn't something that is distracting and causing conflict or certainly unhappiness within the audience. All right. We're all feeling a bit shy this morning, or not able to get into the connection. I would like to know how many of you went and looked at that video game clip I put up. Loazi. Let me see that. Yes, I agree. And I think that has to be the connection that is made, is with the educators. What bothers me a lot of times, and I know Loazi well, and I know that every time there's a concert, he brings his young learners to the concert. What bothers me is that oftentimes educators, because they are so tired themselves and their work, they don't necessarily encourage concert participation or attendance. And I think that is a very, very important part of our future, is working with our music educators and our music lovers. And that is why I'm doing this conversation for you guys. You are the lovers of music. As I've said numerous times, I'm going to say it again. If we can't even encourage our own children to attend our concerts, how can we expect to encourage other generational and diverse audiences? Yeah, I agree with you, Bev. There are a few times. Horses for courses dilemma, and I'm trying to say that I think it is time for change, and I'm hoping that with this video I will encourage those that have been a part of the music world and lovers of music for so long to look and say, how can we be a part of it? I do believe it's part of the collective. I think the South African way has been left up to management and organizers and boards to make a future. Whereas I look at orchestras around the world, the commitment with the musicians as well as the audiences to interactions on social media or word of mouth is a very big part of how they are changing their audiences. There's a wonderful project at the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra where a donor looked over at a symphony concert, a very wealthy local man, and realized that the audience was aging and he wanted to do something about that. So this is obviously a plug for those of you that want to, but he put a sum of money together for the orchestra purely to find innovative ways to bring younger audience members. And they came up with some fantastic ideas, concerts for under 25s that would, part of the ticket would also include a meet and greet afterwards with a bar and snacks and a jazz band or a sort of a fun folk band where a certain group could start their networking, for their future businesses. It's a big part of it, I think, that we also got to remember, the experience. Should the whole thing be an experience, everything from how you enter to how you leave based on the program, the receptions afterwards? Should they not be a part of an experience for select groups or based on the program around you? Yes, I agree, Bev, and I think orchestras and ensembles and performers, we also need to approach the schools with our concerts, tickets available for them, free or cheaper or whatever. Keep the tickets to a price where a young person can actually afford, and have a selection of those tickets just set aside for people of of different backgrounds. Yeah, Lenora, I agree. I think it's always a question of education, but I think certainly in South Africa, where our education systems are so vast in the difference between our top tier and our lower tiers, we have a responsibility, I think, as music lovers to try and find a way to also contribute to that, be it through social media interaction with different people, be it concerts, be it just talks with schools that are less fortunate. It would be nice to have something like that, but also remember, in the schools, they have limited time often for music or arts. Should have social media influences. Yeah, Loizi, I think we're trying something like that, and but probably not enough. And oftentimes, I think we approach it from a generational thing where we think it's the way it is, and younger people see it completely differently. I mean, for my generation, we're still using Facebook. And I certainly look at my teenage children, and Facebook is almost a place of record now. They almost never interact on Facebook and stuff. So it's keeping up with those trends, addressing social media influencers. I like that. I'm not sure who. I think, yeah, who would be a social media influencer for classical music? Well, there you go, Margie. It's about change. It's about going with the times and not sacrificing the music we play. There's not dumbing it down. I've never ever believed that is the way to go. I think that has done more damage than anything else. This music is fantastic. We just have to find ways to package it. Remember, if you look at an average pop song, they're beginning to get shorter and shorter, 2.5 minutes. An average sitcom on a television used to be half an hour. It's now less than 20 minutes for the adverts that happen in between the breaks. Now, if you have and social media that changes, Snapchats that just disappear after X number of minutes, in this sort of disposable society, how do we put on something that lasts 50 minutes and requires that sort of level of concentration? I think that is one of the biggest challenges. Yeah, schools have always been the great part, but remember, many of us are coming from a place of having access and having the privilege of having great schools. We also have to look at what I said earlier. Is it then really only something for those that have had that privilege and that upbringing? Or is it not something we should consider that is for everybody? It is just music after all. The problem is it's a very expensive art form. So how do we encourage young people from different socioeconomic backgrounds that this is a music worth listening to? It doesn't have to cost them anything. If people have access to YouTube or Wi-Fi, which is becoming more and more throughout the world and certainly throughout South Africa, there's still an opportunity for them to listen to these kinds of music and different types of music. How do we reach these people and expose them to this? I do believe a lot has to do with the very first piece. What do you remember as your very first musical exposure to symphonic music or opera or such like? And that is definitely a talk. Yeah, concentration. Bev, it's interesting. Yes, I agree. But I've also watched when a young adult has been engaged in something, how unbelievably committed they become to that experience. The thing we forget about, certainly about millennials, is their love of new experiences, trying something different. It's a big part of it. Have we attempted to embrace that as something different, something new? And when they do concentrate, it's quite remarkable, that level of attention that they will give to it, and how many dive into the world that they suddenly get opened up to. And there again, it's giving them a piece of music or a collection of musics that can really hold their attention, and the level of performance. Yes, that's something that I think about quite a lot with young people. So what I'm going to say is ideas. Anybody that watches this video, I look forward to your ideas. I would love to have input. Michael, I agree. Talking to the audience, engaging with the audience, much of the time is success. I do think there are certain pieces that stand alone, and you have to then, as the performer, engage with them. But I think more and more interaction with audiences, and the conductors that have been very successful in building their audiences have been those conductors. Leonard Slatkin is a great example of that. He always engages with the audience. He takes highly complex modern pieces and gives them something to hold on to when they're listening to, and listening to it in its full performance, brand new works. And he gives an audience sort of markers, places to keep their attention going. So that they find a way to actually understand, and their ears and their concentration don't just shut off. I agree with Jan. Watching them play video games, it's a concentration for hours on end. Bev, it's funny. The young people are different in South Africa and outside South Africa. I'll certainly say many of the young musicians I encounter in the United States are incredibly engaged in those concerts. They form groups of young musicians that come together as friends and colleagues, and they go and they perform with enormous amounts of excitement, almost like they're part of a sports team. I see it occasionally. Sometimes South Africa, was always when I was part of the CPYO, there was a lovely camaraderie amongst those young people. I think there still is very much. So they really throw themselves into it on every single level. Sometimes as they move up, they maybe get influenced in other ways and don't necessarily engage on the same level. Yeah, Loazi, I agree with you. In South Africa, it is an enormous problem. And that is the thing, is maybe concerts, one of those concerts should be taken out of a traditional concert hall, and our traditional audiences should not then avoid that concert. They should still engage in the concert depending where it is, and be a part of the bigger picture and a part of the growth. The concerts should be at in a financial sort of level that the local people can afford, focusing a concert in the community that you are a part of, and doing it more than once. This for me is very, very important. You have to create a relationship, and obviously that is incredibly difficult in a world where things are so expensive, and these concerts can become incredibly high end when it comes to costs. But engaging with the communities, engaging with musicians and your traditional audiences, and then presenting a program that is accessible to those local audiences. I think, Jenny, most audiences would do certainly let them know that it's possible. Glenda, I agree with you. I've had a counter argument from a colleague is, do those communities not want to, get outside the community and experience it somewhere else? Does it have to always be within the community? That was a counter argument once. I must say I agree with you. But it's not just about taking the orchestra or the choir into a different community. It's about your traditional audiences supporting that community as well. And also not just performing your same repertoire every single time in the same way. Maybe presenting it in such a way that is more accessible to that particular community. not the whole piece potentially, if it's a hour and a half piece of music, breaking it up into smaller portions to talk about what's happening, to discuss it, and to engage with the audience. And I think that's the biggest part of what I'm trying to say, is the engaging with audiences and new communities is our responsibility. Yeah, Lenora, absolutely. And you'll notice with the symphony choir, we generally do try and get information out. Yes, you have to make sure that you have a way to engage with that community, not assume that what you are bringing to a community is something they want. All right, that is pretty much what I have time for today. Running to the end of my thoughts and ideas. As I said, I would love the opportunity for people to continue this conversation. If you'd rather do it directly with me, you can go to either my personal page, which is Alex Fokkens, or Alexander Fokkens, and send me a message. Ideas, thoughts, differences of opinion are always valid and exciting for me to look at and see how we can actually make this open to more and more people as we go into the next phase. This is the time when we have time to think about this and not just survive, that we can look at the possibilities of how we change what we do. Thank you, Bev. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. Please don't forget to engage. This, if you want to have a look again, this is up on Facebook, the Symphony Choir. I generally put it on my professional page as well, and I'm now running a YouTube channel where all the conversations are up there as well. If you have an interest to look at it, or if you want to share with your friends, please do so. Yes, Glenda, I agree. Thank you for joining us, Loazi. Thank you, everybody. You have a wonderful week, and we will publicize. I think maybe we continue as the lockdown, and we, as a choir members, we are not able to meet. I think I'll try and find a way to engage at 11 o'clock on a Monday with you on something different next week. I know I've had some suggestions. Some suggestions I feel are a little bit tricky for me in this platform, but I will certainly do what I can to continue. Thank you very much to all of you for joining. Please, as I said, share it far and wide, and don't forget, engage with myself and those around you to make sure that this incredible music that we all love and enjoy is something that is shared but further and wider.